A series of political disputes have strained the relationship between China and Australia. This relationship has further deteriorated with the establishment of Aukus, a new alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US. It's been more than a year since China began imposing tariffs, bonds, and other punitive measures against different imports from Australia, attempting to hurt its economy and force its concessions. However, when we look at the trade numbers between the two countries in the past year, we find that the CCP itself almost entirely swallows the bitter consequences of its crackdown on Australia. Therefore, some commentators have said that the CCP has perfectly illustrated the act of shooting oneself in the foot. Let's look at the CCP's very first ban on Australia, barley. China began to impose an 80% import tariff on Australian barley in May 2020, including a 73.6% anti-dumping duty and a 6.9% countervailing duty with a 5-year term. Afterward, China switched to buying large quantities of barley from Canada. Canadian government figures show a 5-fold increase in the value of barley exports to China between July 2020 and March 2021. Because of China's retaliatory tariffs, Australia exported only 880 tons of barley to China in November 2020, the lowest number in 10 years. Previously, the Chinese market accounted for 70% of Australia's total barley exports. Australian barley traders are actively exploring new markets from the Middle East to Japan, South Asia, and even Mexico, with Saudi Arabia expected to become Australia's largest market in 2021. Moreover, Australian farmers are also switching to other crops, such as wheat. Even if China does not buy from Australia, the overall export volume of Australian barley remains steady. What is originally expected to be sold to China is sold to other countries, offsetting the impact of losing the Chinese market. The Australian Bureau of Statistics predicts a 64% surge in barley exports through October 2021. Barley's exports in Australia are increasing rather than decreasing, and there are few bankruptcies. While China has banned Australian barley, ironically, China is now snapping up Australian wheat. A Reuters report on September 24th quoted 3 trade sources and an analyst saying that China has become a significant buyer of Australia's upcoming wheat harvest. Of the approximately 5 million tons of wheat sold so far for the 2021-2022 crop year, Chinese buyers have acquired nearly 2 million tons, which will be harvested at the end of the year. China is the world's largest wheat producer and consumer. In August, global wheat prices climbed to their highest level since 2013. Australia is expected to have a bumper crop for the second year in a row, while producers in the Northern Hemisphere were hit hard by bad weather and drought. For example, Russia suffered bad weather while the US and Canada were hit by drought. French wheat has seen a downgrade in quality. According to a Singapore-based trader for an international food supply company, Chinese buyers have cancelled some French wheat shipments due to quality issues, and they are turning to Australian wheat in a big way. An agricultural analyst at National Australia Bank said, "When it comes to food security in China or any other country, it's all about getting quality wheat supplies at the right price. Sure, they're posturing on the trade dispute, but grain supply is what's at stake." In May 2020, China imposed an anti-dumping duty on Australian barley, while at the same time it announced a ban on beef imports from 4 Australian beef producers. In October 2020, Chinese cotton mills were asked to stop buying Australian cotton. In November, Chinese customs allowed about $2 million Australian dollars worth of Australian lobsters, over 20 tons, to rot at Shanghai airport under the pretext of security checks. And at the end of the same month, China's Ministry of Commerce removed Australian wine producers from the market under the pretext of anti-dumping. In December 2020, China announced a ban on coal imports from Australia. Total Chinese investment in Australia fell by 62% in 2020. The various Australian industries blacklisted by the CCP have chosen to do the same as the barley industry, moving promptly to find new outlets. Take cotton, for example. In October 2020, Chinese cotton mills were asked to stop buying Australian cotton. Chinese imports of Australian cotton then fell from a peak in October worth about $34 million to about $640,000 in January 2021. Figures from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade show that although the overall export volume of cotton fell from October 2020 to January 2021, it has rebounded by February 2021. In particular, cotton exports to Indonesia rose fivefold in February compared to January. China's cotton website acknowledges that the amount of Australian cotton imported into China in June 2021 has increased by over 634% year-on-year, and that the only new cotton available to Chinese textile companies in August to November 2021 is either Brazilian cotton or Australian cotton, with Australian cotton having significant advantages in quality, transportation, and settlement. Then, Australia's red wine. A Taiwanese media reported that a Taiwanese businessman in Sydney and the chairman of the Australia and Taiwan International Investment Company said, "In the past few years, our annual production was about 300,000 bottles of wine, almost all of which went to China. But after the ban, we have shifted 30% of our sales to Taiwan." In his opinion, such a change is not a bad thing. He said, "China promises you 50,000 bottles today, but then cancels your order at the last minute, and this has happened too many times in the past." The Australian Finance Minister noted on September 6th that China's trade action had reduced Australia's total exports to China by about 5.4 billion Australian dollars in the year to June. But over the same period, exports of these goods to the rest of the world increased by 4.4 billion Australian dollars. The deterioration in Australia-China relations has affected many products. However, iron ore, a major commodity, has not only been spared, but also has brought considerable profits to Australia as prices have soared, offsetting losses in other areas incurred by the communist ban. When it comes to iron ore, China has very few alternatives. According to estimates by an Australian bank, Westpac, Australia accounts for 60% of China's iron ore imports and ships 900 million tons of iron ore to China each year. Due to the negative impact of the China-Australia relationship and reduced production, international iron ore prices have continued to reach new highs. Australian iron ore prices peaked at $230 a ton in May 2021, the highest price in 10 years. Chinese officials met at the end of May 2021 and threatened to reduce iron ore purchases from Australia to hamper its economy. China's Steel Industry Association then announced that it would cut 236 million tons of steel production capacity by 2025 to depress the iron ore price. But the Bank of America said in early June that as long as global demand for iron ore remains strong, including in China, the CCP is unlikely to depress iron ore prices. And as China tries to revive its economy devastated by the global pandemic with a $500 billion investment in new infrastructure, demand for iron ore in Beijing is now as high as it has ever been. More than half of the world's iron ore supply comes from Australia, followed by Brazil. However, Brazil has recently experienced interruptions in its iron ore supply due to the outbreak. Australia's dominant market position, coupled with the projected failure of Brazil's ability to restore iron ore production fully by the end of 2022, has put the CCP in a predicament. With its desperate need for iron ore, the CCP has no other alternative but to turn to Australian iron ore despite the conflict between the two countries. Because of China's large imports of Australian iron ore, exports to China accounted for more than 40% of Australian total foreign trade exports in May 2021. Data released by China's General Administration of Customs on September 7, 2021, showed that China's imports of iron ore and its concentrates surged by 10.2% in August to 97.492 million tons month-on-month, despite the Chinese government's attempts to reduce steel production and ease the rise in commodity prices. Australia makes up 60% of China's iron ore imports, so the more China imports, the more Australia exports. Although detailed data is not yet available, it can be predicted that China's iron ore imports from Australia would have reached a record high in August. Australia's success in stemming the outbreak means that Australia is well placed to reap the dividends of higher commodity prices more readily. The Australian Department of Industry forecasts that iron ore exports will grow from 103 billion Australian dollars in fiscal 2019-2020 to 149 billion in 2020 to 2021, before falling back to 113 billion Australian dollars in 2022-23 due to soaring prices and a surge in market demand. On the Beijing side, rising commodity prices such as iron ore have put cost pressure on China's manufacturing sector, causing anxiety for the Communist Party. For China, which imports billions of tons of iron ore from overseas each year, every $1 increase in iron ore prices means a $1 billion difference. The ramifications of the interest involved are enormous. On the morning of May 23, 2021, 5 government departments jointly interviewed China's leading enterprises with high market influence in the iron ore, steel, copper, and aluminum industries, saying that some commodity prices have continued to rise sharply in 2021, causing disruptions to the normal production and sales cycle. According to media reports in China, the most significant short-term impact of the rise in iron ore price in Australia should be the consequent climb in domestic steel prices. Because without iron ore, the losses from one day of steel mill downtime could be greater than the losses from the collapse of several Australian mining companies altogether. For many downstream companies and end consumers, there will be enormous pressure and some projects will be forced to stop work. Sectors concerned with people's livelihoods such as real estate, automobiles, railroads, and other infrastructure will also be impacted. In late September, more than 2/3 of China's provinces pulled the plug on electricity, indicating a massive power shortage crisis in China. Chinese officials claim that the crisis has nothing to do with the boycott of Australian coal, because coal imports from Australia account for only 1.9% of China's total coal use. In reality, this is not the case. Thermal power generation in China has long accounted for about 70% of the country's total electricity production. As the primary source of fuel, coal is used in nearly 90% of thermal power generation. However, the government set the electricity price in China, and it has remained very low for a long time. Australia's high-quality coal used to be China's primary source of coal imports, accounting for nearly 40% of coal imports and at a price half that of China's domestic coal. So, many power plants along China's coast have long been retrofitting their units to burn Australian coal. When Australian coal is banned, retrofitted plants cannot even use domestic coal, thus significantly reducing the amount of electricity produced. Moreover, the domestic coal price rises with the market and has been high, while the electricity price remains low without adjustment. The cost for power generation is becoming prohibitively high, leading to a phenomenon where the more one produces, the more losses it incurs. To control the magnitude of losses, power plants can only reduce their production. The director of China Huadian Corporation, one of China's largest energy groups, told the Financial Times in December 2020, "Because Australian coal is more efficient, many local power plants rely on it, and now they are having difficulty finding alternative sources of energy. Restricting imports is enough to change the entire industry landscape." In addition, news.com.au reported that Australian coal company Whitehaven Coal said that China has switched to buying coal from Russia, Indonesia, and South Africa at a higher cost. Australian coal producers are also finding new customers and exporting coal to other countries including India, Pakistan, and the Middle East, but the coal sent to these places is eventually shipped to China. That is, in such deals, China is effectively served as a gullible buyer, ending up spending more money on Australian coal. Of course, it's possible that Beijing will quietly buy Australian products but will not openly admit that it has made a bad decision.
当前中澳关系的困难局面是澳方一手造成的。
The current difficult situation in China-Australia relations has been caused by Australia alone. It's not what China wants to see. Australia is quite aware of what has happened. What's imperative now for Australia is to face up to the crux of the setback in the bilateral ties and reflect on whether to treat China as a partner or a threat.
China used to be Australia's largest trading partner, but the two sides have been at loggerheads since 2016 when the Australian authorities sought to block the infiltration of Chinese capital and spies. Australia was the first Western country to ban the use of Huawei's 5G network in 2018. After advocating for an independent investigation into the origins of the new coronavirus outbreak in April 2020, it has met a series of import bans from Beijing and a hiatus in ministerial-level relations with China. In April 2021, the Australian government introduced a new law to cancel 2 Belt and Road agreements between Beijing and Victoria, and several infrastructure projects with China have been halted. Australia is not going down the drain because of its confrontation with the CCP. On September 15, 2021, the US, UK, and Australia formally formed a new alliance, Aukus. Australia will receive help from the US and UK to build 8 nuclear submarines. It can be said that Australia's strategic status and role in the Indo-Pacific region has been dramatically elevated, making it the most trusted partner of the US in the Indo-Pacific region and a symbol of resistance to the CCP in the Southern Hemisphere.
美国、英国、澳大利亚以租借、出口
The nuclear submarine cooperation between the US, the UK, and Australia in any form of leasing, export, or joint research and development will seriously intensify the arms race in the region, jeopardize regional peace and stability, undermine the international efforts of nuclear non-proliferation, and harm the peace and security of the world. China will join the international community to resolutely oppose and strongly condemn it. The US-UK-Australia cooperation poses serious risks of nuclear proliferation and violates the spirit of the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons.
There is an open invitation for President Xi and I to discuss these and many other matters, and that has always been there. Australia remains open to discuss these and all issues that are important to the Indo-Pacific. I believe and I hope we would both share the same objective of a peaceful Indo-Pacific where the sovereignty and independence of nations is understood and respected, and that enables their own citizens to flourish. And that's what we all want. It is not an uncommon thing for countries to take decisions in their own strategic interests and to build up their defence capabilities. China makes the same decisions, as does other countries within our region.
Australia has so far withstood the economic blow, demonstrating to the world how smaller countries can redefine their relationship with the CCP. Australia's victory over a red regime wielding an economic baton has also given the rest of the world the courage to say no to the Chinese Communist Party.